It's their first taste of freedom. Researchers are releasing several Przewalski horses into the wild.
It's the only truly wild.
In December 1986, 11 horses stepped off a cargo plane onto one of the harshest pieces of land on Earth, a stretch of northwestern China, so dead, so brutally cold, and so completely stripped of life that local ranchers had given up trying to work it years earlier. No grass, no reliable water, winters that could drop to 40 below zero. The nearest drinkable water, sometimes buried under thick ice, miles from nowhere. The scientists watching this moment had given these animals roughly a 15% chance of surviving their first winter. A prominent ecology journal had already called the project a waste of money. A BBC film crew showed up, watched for 2 days, and flew home convinced they had just witnessed the beginning of a slow-motion disaster. What happened over the next 37 years turned out to be one of the most startling ecological stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. Not just because the horses survived, but because of what they did to the land around them, something that would eventually force scientists to rethink everything they thought they knew about how deserts are made and whether they can be unmade. Before we get into what actually happened, if you enjoy deep dives into stories where nature does something nobody expected, go ahead and subscribe, drop a like on this video, and tell us in the comments which extinct animal you think the world most needs back. It helps us keep making these. Now, let's get into it.to understand why anyone thought putting horses into this desert was a good idea. You first have to understand how catastrophically bad things had gotten in the Yungar Basin by the mid-1980s. This region of northwestern China's Xinjiang province had once been an extraordinary ecosystem, a vast steppe grassland that had supported wild horses, gazelles, wolves, and hundreds of plant species for thousands of years. The soil was rich. The grass was deep. Seasonal rains soaked into ground that had been built up and maintained over millennia by the hooves, grazing patterns, and dung of the animals that lived there. Then, over the course of a few decades, the wild horses disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of truly wild horse in the area was recorded in the late 1960s, noted by researchers passing through the region. After that, silence. And what followed that silence was an ecological unraveling that moved faster than almost anyone predicted. Without the animals whose behavior had shaped the land for thousands of years, the soil surface began to change. Grass thinned and died back. Without root systems holding the ground together, and without hooves periodically breaking the crust, the topsoil hardened into what researchers would later describe in almost surreal terms, a compacted surface so impermeable that rain, when it did fall, simply ran off the top without soaking in. For 6 inches of rain still fell on the Yungar Basin every year. Almost none of it was reaching plant roots anymore. By the early 1980s, satellite imagery was showing something alarming. The Gobi Desert, already enormous, was expanding outward into surrounding grasslands at a rate of roughly 70 kilometers per decade. Villages were being buried. Highways built in the 1970s were being rerouted because sand was covering them. And the problem wasn't staying local. In March 1983, a single dust storm originating in the degraded steppe sent tens of thousands of tons of topsoil over Beijing, more than 1,000 miles away. Hospitals in the capital recorded a spike in respiratory emergencies that lasted for days. People were breathing in the disintegrated remnants of a grassland ecosystem that had collapsed on the other side of the country. China responded with one of the most ambitious land management projects in history. Beginning in 1978, a massive tree planting initiative aimed to create a living barrier across the country's northern frontier, hundreds of millions of trees planted in rows to catch blowing sand and stabilize the soil. The results were deeply mixed. In some regions, the trees helped. In others, they made things worse. Trees planted in rows in a semi-arid environment need significantly more water than grassland does. In areas where the water table was already stressed, mass tree planting pulled groundwater down further, killing the trees themselves and leaving the land more vulnerable than before. Wells in some farming communities ran dry. Villages had to relocate. By 1985, China was running out of good options. And that's the moment a researcher named Yong Jiaming walked into a government meeting with a proposal that sounded, to most of the officials in the room, completely disconnected from the scale of the crisis they were facing. Stop fighting the desert with trees and machinery, he said. Bring back the wild horse. The horse Yong was proposing to bring back was just any horse. It was the Przewalski's horse, named after the Russian explorer who formally documented the species for Western science in the 19th century, though the animals had been known to people in Central Asia for thousands of years. In fact, the oldest cave paintings in Europe depict horses that look almost identical to this species: stocky builds, upright manes, faint striping on the legs, a profile so ancient it looks like something a child would draw when asked to picture the world's very first horse. Genetically, the Przewalski's horse sits apart from every domestic breed on Earth. It carries 66 chromosomes, compared to 64 in domestic horses, a difference that reflects a completely separate evolutionary lineage. This is not a horse that was once wild and then tamed. This is a horse that was never domesticated, never broken, never bred for human purposes. It is, by every biological measure, the last genuinely wild horse species still alive. By 1985, the situation for the species was dire. The entire global population of Przewalski's horses consisted of roughly 900 individuals, every single one of them in captivity, in zoos across Europe and North America. The wild population was gone. The species had effectively been extinct in the wild since the late 1960s. And all 900 living animals trace their ancestry back to just 12 to 14 individuals captured by Russian expeditions at the turn of the 20th century. That genetic bottleneck, the species having come so close to total extinction that every living member is descended from barely a dozen animals, left a mark that scientists can still read in the DNA of every Przewalski's horse alive today. A tone point during the Second World War, the entire species survived in just 2 zoos, in Munich and Prague. The fact that the species still existed by 1985 was already something close to a miracle. Young's argument to the government wasn't purely sentimental. It was ecological and ultimately economic. He wasn't proposing to bring back a species because it was beautiful or because it was historically significant, though both things were true. He was proposing to bring it back because of something specific that these horses do to land, something no machine, no tree, and no human engineering project had been able to replicate. Here is the thing that makes this story genuinely strange. Most people think of large grazing animals as consumers, as things that take from an ecosystem. Eat the grass, drink the water, move on. That's not what Przewalski's horses do. Not in an environment like the Yungar Basin. Their hooves hit the ground with enough force to shatter compacted soil, breaking the hardened crust that was preventing rainfall from penetrating the surface. But unlike a mechanical tiller, which breaks soil indiscriminately and often does its own damage, horses are selective. They move around fragile young plants. They concentrate their impact on bare, hardened ground and dead vegetation. The result is a pattern of small depressions and aerated patches spread across the landscape, each one acting as a tiny catchment for rain that would otherwise sheet off and evaporate. Then there's how they move. Przewalski's horses don't graze in one spot until it's exhausted and then shuffle to the next. They follow routes that researchers, after fitting GPS collars to monitor them, found look almost mathematical in their structure, covering substantial distances daily in patterns that create what ecologists call a disturbance mosaic. Some patches grazed short, others left tall. Bare soil here, dense growth there. The result is not a uniform landscape, but a patchwork of microhabitats, each supporting a slightly different community of insects, birds, and small animals. And then there's what comes out the other end. Horse manure, it turns out, is an extraordinarily effective seed delivery system. Analysis of Przewalski's horse dung found viable seeds from dozens of plant species, and the passage through the horse's digestive system actually improved germination rates significantly, breaking down tough seed coatings that would otherwise prevent germination for years. Seeds that had been locked in dormancy were being cracked open and deposited in a self-contained packet of fertilizer, spread across miles of landscape every single day as the horses moved through their routes. Young's pitch to the government was essentially this: these horses are not just animals. They area a biological technology that evolution spent hundreds of thousands of years developing. The Yungar Basin had evolved around them. When they disappeared, the basin started eating. Bring them back, and let them do what they were built to do. The 11 horses that arrived in December 1986 had never experienced a temperature below freezing. They had spent their entire lives and their parents' entire lives in zoo enclosures with heated shelters, automatic water dispensers, and hay delivered on a schedule. They had no experience reading a landscape for water, no experience recognizing predator sounds, no experience doing anything that the wild required. The first winter was brutal by any measure. Temperatures in the Yungar Basin dropped to extremes that the horses had never encountered. Botfly infestation spread through the herd within weeks off arrival, a painful parasitic problem that damaged digestion at exactly the moment the animals needed every calorie they could get. 2 mares miscarried in the cold. Several horses developed serious frostbite. The international conservation community watched with deep skepticism. Research journals were preparing what they assumed would be post-mortems of a failed experiment. And then the horses started doing things nobody had seen them do before. The stallions began breaking ice with their front hooves to reach water underneath, a behavior that had never been observed in zoo populations anywhere. The mares organized themselves into rotating windbreaks during storms, clustering around the youngest animals and switching positions as individuals got too cold. The herd learned to dig through snow with a sweeping motion of their front legs, uncovering dried grass buried under drifts. They started reading the wind and the terrain, figuring out which exposed ridgelines had been swept clear by the cold and which low-lying areas were buried under dangerous depth. These were not behaviors anyone had taught them. These were not behaviors their zoo-born parents could have modeled. Something in the genetic memory of the species, dormant through 3 and 4 generations of captivity, was switching back on. The horses survived that first winter. And then something happened that shifted the project from a survival story into something far more significant. By spring of 1987, plant species that researchers had not recorded in the basin for nearly 2 decades began appearing in the areas where the horses had been grazing. The hoof impact was doing exactly what Young had predicted, breaking up the hardened surface and allowing both rainfall and seeds to penetrate. Soil moisture measurements in grazed areas started climbing. Nitrogen levels, which had crashed dramatically during the years of ecological collapse, began to recover as the horses' manure reintroduced microbial life the soil had been missing. Each year, the recovery accelerated. Dung beetles reappeared in numbers. Insects that depended on the plant species returning to the basin started showing up in surveys. Birds followed the insects. Small mammals followed the birds. And the predators came back too. Foxes and raptors initially, with occasional evidence of wolves passing through the edges of the territory. By 2001, with the herd at the Acclimatization Center in Gimserhaven grown substantially, the project took its boldest step. 27 horses were selected for full release into the Kalamali Nature Reserve for 1,000 square kilometers of desert with no fences, no supplemental feeding, and no intervention planned unless the population faced catastrophic decline. Among those released was a stallion that had been at the center of the Jim Sar herd for years, a horse the researchers had been watching closely since his arrival. For the first week after release, the newly freed horses stayed close to where they had been left, moving in nervous circles, grazing cautiously, watching. And then, on the 8th day, something happened that the monitoring team would spend years trying to explain. The stallion began walking north, not drifting, not grazing, walking with a direction, his group falling in behind him. The GPS dots on the monitoring screen moved steadily for hours. By the time he stopped, he had led the group 30 kilometers to a spring-fed water source that did not appear on any of the project's maps, a water source that no living horse in this bloodline had ever visited. He stood next to it the next morning when the research team drove out to verify what their instruments had recorded, as if he had been visiting it his whole life. How he found it remains an open question. Ancestral memory, scent carried on the wind. Some geological or environmental signal that horses can read and humans cannot. Nobody knows. But the image of that moment, a zoo-born animal leading a group of zoo-born animals straight to hidden water in a desert where everything was supposed to kill them, became one of the defining images of the entire project. By 2023, those original 11 horses had become more than 500 individuals roaming a restored landscape that scientists in the 1980s had believed was permanently dead. When ecological economists sat down to calculate what the presence of these horses was actually worth in measurable terms, soil restoration, seed dispersal, water retention improvement, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity support, the numbers were substantial. The herd was collectively generating tens of millions of dollars in ecological value annually, managing and restoring an area of land larger than many national parks, and all without a single human worker, a single machine, or a single drop of irrigation water. The water table in the core of the restoration zone, which had been dropping steadily since the wild horses vanished, stabilized, and then began to rise. Green patches visible in satellite imagery expanded outward year by year from the areas of densest horse activity, like slow-motion ripples moving across the desert in every direction. Meanwhile, the comparison with China's tree planting program became impossible tenure for those paying attention. By 2010, China had invested tens of billions of dollars planting trees across its northern frontier, many of which had drawn down groundwater faster than it could be replenished, making the underlying land degradation worse in certain areas rather than better. In the zones where the horses were active, water was returning to the ground rather than being pulled out of it. The same landscape was being made wetter, not drier. The model spread. Mongolia established a reintroduction program that by 2023 had built a population of nearly 500 Przewalski's Horsin-Hustai National Park, with surrounding steppe showing the same patterns of soil and plant recovery. Kazakhstan launched its own program. Russia began studying the data. China is now planning to expand a reserve by hundreds of additional square kilometers, with a long-term population target that, if reached, could restore 100,000 hectares of degraded land and support hundreds of species of plants and animals that currently exist nowhere else in the region. The 11 animals that stepped off that plane in 1986 onto a desert that every serious expert on Earth believed would kill them were not a solution that anyone had designed. They were a solution that evolution had already designed, tested across hundreds of thousands of years, and then lost when we removed it from a landscape. The story of the Przewalski's horse in the Unger Basin is a story about what happens when human beings stop trying to engineer nature and start paying attention to what nature had already figured out long before we arrived. The horses didn't need to be told what to do. They needed to be given the chance to do it. And that leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Not just for China, not just for this desert. For every degraded ecosystem on Earth where the original architects, the animals that built and maintained the landscape for millennia, have been removed. How many of the environmental crises we're spending trillions of dollars trying to solve with technology and engineering have solutions that are already written into the DNA of species we drove out, species that are still, in some cases, just barely holding on in captivity, waiting for someone to take them back to where they belong? Drop your answer in the comments. If you could return one lost species to one broken landscape anywhere on Earth, what would it be, and where would you send it? If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.